Okay, and Mr. Deutsch, you look perfect. You're centered. It's great. Let's just try your audio really quick.
Okay, great. How's this?
Absolutely perfect. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
And so for everyone, we are just waiting for the majority and the minority stream to come online. And so we're waiting on that, maybe a few more minutes. I need to call the recording studio right now and check on that. But we will be beginning as soon as we do get those things up online. So thank you, thank you.
question. Ms. Dean says she has gotten over to having connectivity issues. Could somebody like
And to our members, we are just waiting for the minority to bring their stream up. It should just be a few more minutes. Thank you so much.
Judiciary Committee will please come to order, a quorum being present. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2 and House Rule 11, Clause 2, the Chair may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment for which a recorded vote for the ayes and nays are ordered. I would like to remind members that we have established an email address and distribution list dedicated to circulating amendments, exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of our hearing today. If you would like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as we can. I would also ask all members, both those in person and those appearing remotely, to mute your microphones when you are not speaking. This will help prevent feedback and other technical issues. You may unmute yourself at any time you seek recognition. Before we begin, I want to note the passing of Cheryl Sensenbrenner, the beloved wife of our colleague Jim Sensenbrenner. Cheryl was known as a tireless advocate for people with disabilities, a cause that her husband has championed for many years as well, and was a loving companion for 43 years. I know that I speak for everyone on the committee in offering our deepest condolences to Jim and his entire family. May her memory be a blessing. I would now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Jordan, for any comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate those kind words. Jim Sensenbrenner, former chairman, is a wonderful human being, and while I didn't know Cheryl well, Cheryl's the same, and 43 years together with his mate is special, and we all we all keep Jim and his family in our thoughts and prayers, and I appreciate the chairman's kind words. Yield back.
Thank you. Before I make my opening statement, I want to briefly address the new guidance from the Sergeant at Arms that the Office of the Attending Physician released yesterday concerning preventing the spread of COVID-19. The guidance states, for U.S. House of Representatives meetings in a limited enclosed space, such as a committee hearing room, for greater than 15 minutes, face coverings are required. This new advice is based on the best available scientific evidence we have about how the coronavirus spreads. It is based on the best practices issued by the Trump administration Centers for Disease Control and is supported by the world's top infectious disease experts like Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Deborah Birx, who serve on President Trump's White House Coronavirus Task Force. The attending physician's new guidance does not mince words. It says that meetings in which, quote, individuals assemble from various regions of the country in large numbers and appropriate social distancing is difficult to maintain are the highest risk for transmission of the disease. One critical means to reduce this risk is to wear a mask. Wearing a mask not only helps protect you from getting sick from this deadly virus, it helps protect the other people in this room from getting sick. After this markup is over, we will go home to our loved ones. Wearing a mask helps protect them from serious illness as well. As chairman, I have the duty and responsibility to maintain order and decorum in our proceedings, which includes making sure that we conduct our business in a safe manner. In light of the attending physician's new guidance, I therefore fully expect all members on both sides of the aisle to wear a mask at all times that you are not speaking. If for whatever reason you are not willing to wear a mask, the House rules provide a way to participate remotely from your office without being physically present in this room. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7120, the Justice and Policing Act of 2020, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 7120 to hold law enforcement accountable for misconduct in court, improve transparency through data collection, and reform police training and policies.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I would begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. Last week, George Floyd's brother, Philonise, sat in this room and he told us of the pain he felt watching the video of his brother being killed by a Minneapolis police officer. He gave voice to the pain that all of us have felt over the last few weeks. He also spoke to the anger of knowing that George Floyd was only the latest in a much too long list of victims of police brutality, disproportionately people of color. He spoke to the frustration that time and again, in the face of overwhelming evidence that dramatic reform is needed, Congress has done very little. Mr. Floyd charged us with making sure that his brother's death would not be in vain, and he pleaded with us to turn the pain and anger that we all feel into meaningful change. His words echoed the voices of millions of Americans who have taken to the streets in the last few weeks to seek justice and to demand action. Today, we answer their call. We value and respect the many brave and honorable police officers who put their lives on the line every day to protect us in our communities. Those of us who were here in 1998 will never forget the courageous actions and ultimate sacrifice that Capitol Police officers Jacob Chestnut and Detective John Gibson made in this building while protecting others. We owe them and the other officers killed in the line of duty each year a debt that we can never repay. And that includes Officer Patrick Underwood, who was shot and killed in the line of duty several weeks ago. But we must acknowledge that too many law enforcement officers do not uphold the ethic of protecting and serving their community. Instead, the reality for too many Americans, especially for African Americans, is that police officers are perceived as a threat to their liberties, to their dignity, and too often to their safety. This is not a new problem. Centuries of systemic and structural racism have infected all of our institutions. We see it in the rates of COVID deaths, in our system of mass incarceration, and in the vast chasm of economic inequality, all of which fall disproportionately on the backs of African Americans. And we see it in the harassment and excessive force that people of color routinely face by too many of our police officers. An unmistakable message has been sent to African Americans in this country that they are second-class citizens and that their lives are somehow of less value. Well, let me state clearly and unequivocally that Black lives matter. George Floyd mattered. Breonna Taylor mattered. Eric Garner, Amadou Diallo, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, and Laquan McDonald mattered. Rayshard Brooks mattered. And the countless other people who have lost their lives at the hands of law enforcement mattered. For far too long, pleas for justice and reform have fallen on deaf ears in Congress, but that changes today. The Justice in Policing Act would finally allow for meaningful accountability in cases of police misconduct, and it would begin the process of reimagining policing in the 21st century. This legislation, which currently has 227 co-sponsors in the House and 36 co-sponsors in the Senate, makes it easier for the federal government to successfully prosecute police misconduct cases, bans chokeholds, ends racial and religious profiling, encourages prosecutions independent from local police, and eliminates the dubious court-made doctrine of qualified immunity in civil rights lawsuits against law enforcement officers. At the same time, it addresses systemic racism and works to prevent police violence and bias through a series of front-end approaches aimed at encouraging departments to meet a gold standard in training, hiring, de-escalation strategies, bystander duty, and use of body cameras and other best practices. The goal of this legislation is to achieve a guardian, not warrior, model of policing. The bill also mandates the collection and public designation of data on a number of key policing matters, including a first-ever national database on police misconduct incidents to prevent the movement of dangerous officers from department to department. It ends no-knock warrants and the militarization of local policing, and it specifies that lynching is a federal hate crime. The bill does all of this while using no federal funds for police departments except where constitutionally mandated for data collection, and the conditions all repurposed existing funding for the support of these programs. It also creates a new grant program for community-based organizations to create local commissions and task forces on policing innovation, to reimagine how public safety could work in a truly equitable and just way in each community. I want to thank the gentlelady from California, Ms. Bass, the chair of the Crime Subcommittee and the sponsor of this legislation, for her tremendous work in crafting a bill that is at once bold and transformative to meet the moment that calls out for sweeping reform, while also taking a responsible and balanced approach to the many complicated issues associated with policing. In addition, I want to thank the many members of this committee who have worked on and introduced legislation that is included in the legislation before us today. I also want to thank the activists who are leading protests across the country. It is because of you that we are here today considering the most significant reforms to policing in a generation. It is because of your energy, your determination, and your demands for justice that the nation has awakened to the need for action. To the families of those who have lost their lives at the hands of law enforcement, everyone in this room mourns with you. But today we will offer more than just sympathy. Today we are proposing meaningful change. Thoughts and prayers are not enough. Pledges to study the problem are not enough. Half measures are not enough. To the members of this committee, the Justice in Policing Act is our opportunity to show the world that we are listening and that we will respond with real and lasting reforms. We must not let this moment slip away. If we find ourselves here again, listening to the heartbreaking testimony of another grieving family member, wondering why we did not act when we had the chance, it will be a stain on our legacy. We must not let that happen. I urge all of my colleagues to support this vital legislation. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I should maybe also point out for the members that our colleague from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, lost his wife suddenly last evening as well. So we want to think of the Barr family also. Mr. Chair, 4 fundamental principles should form the framework for our public policy development here in the Judiciary Committee. First of all, what happened to George Floyd is a tragedy what happened to Pat Underwood is also a tragedy. They're as wrong could be, and we should work so that it doesn't happen again. Their families deserve to see swift justice for their killers. Second, peaceful protest is important. It's part of our First Amendment liberties. We've all engaged in it. But there is a big difference, as I said last week, a big difference between peaceful protest and rioting, a big difference between peaceful protest and looting, a big difference between peaceful protest and violence, and frankly, a big difference between peaceful protest and attacking our police officers or forming these new autonomous zones that we see in the city of Seattle, Chaz, CHOP, whatever the designation is. There is a big difference. Third, the vast majority of police officers do a great job. They risk their lives every single day to protect our communities. They're the individuals who rushed into the Twin Towers on 9/11. They're the individuals here on Capitol Hill who protect us every single day. They're the guys back in our communities who put on that uniform every single shift and risk their lives, and we should remember that as we develop policy here in the Judiciary Committee. And finally, fourth, defunding the police, dismantling police departments is one of the craziest public policy proposals I have ever heard. Those four principles should form a framework for what we develop today that helps address this real concern in our country. 2 weeks ago, the president said in his speech in Florida, laid out the mission clearly. He talked about healing, not hatred, justice, not chaos. Those words underscore what we heard from George Floyd's brother just a week ago. Just last week, when he sat here in such a compelling way, talked about three simple words, one sentence: life is precious. Life is precious. George Floyd's life, Ahmaud Arbery's life, Breonna Taylor's life, Rashad Brooks' life, and David Dorn and Pat Underwood's life as well. Each life is precious. Everyone here understands that, and we have an obligation to make improvements to public policy that recognize that basic fact that was said so well by George Floyd's brother last week. The president understands it as well. Just yesterday, he gathered together the families of fallen law enforcement officers and the families of victims of police brutality at the White House as part of his executive order that lays the groundwork, the signing of his executive order that lays the groundwork for beginning to address these real concerns. But even before the executive order, this administration worked with us on good policy, good, strong policy. Mr. Collins, Mr. Jeffries, and others on this committee, all of us on this committee, with the First Step Act, great piece of legislation, real prison reform. This administration has worked to help support historically black colleges and support for opportunity zones, support for school choice, all good policies where we all work together. I hope that's what happens today. I hope my colleagues on the Democrat side of the aisle will work with us. The many amendments that we plan to offer that we think function within these four principles I talked about and will help deal with the situation. But it didn't start off that way. Not one single Republican was consulted with the bill that we're marking up today. Not one. You guys introduced it, didn't talk with us. So I hope today that you will embrace our thoughtful amendments that we plan to offer, amendments that are consistent with the Constitution, consistent with the rule of law, consistent with those four principles, and consistent with Mr. Floyd's words that life is precious. That is our goal on the Republican side, and I look forward to the next several hours as we mark up this legislation that we can adopt Republican amendments that we think will make this legislation the kind of legislation our country wants us to develop here in the House Judiciary Committee. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize the chair of the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, the gentlelady from California, and the sponsor of this legislation, Ms. Bass, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And let me begin by offering my prayers to Representative Sensenbrenner. He is my travel partner to Africa. We've traveled a number of times together, and we've had many conversations about his wife from the time when she first took ill through her illness over these few years. So my prayers and thoughts are definitely with him. 2 weeks ago, the world witnessed a horrific crime on the streets of Minneapolis, the slow, torturous murder of George Floyd. I also want to acknowledge the murder of Dave Patrick Underwood, and last week we were able to meet his sister and hear about him. And members, you may or may not have heard that the person that killed him was arrested yesterday. And it turns out that that person had deliberately infiltrated the protesters with the objective to kill police officers. And he was a member of a right-wing organization that believed in creating chaos. And I'm very glad, I don't, obviously he has to be tried and all, but I am glad that that arrest took place. The tragic death of Mr. Floyd has galvanized the entire nation to take a look at our history, because Black Americans have actually been sadly marching for over 100 years to bring attention to this gross injustice that we have faced really for centuries in this country. We've marched against police abuse and for the police to protect and serve our communities like they do elsewhere. In the 1950s, it was news cameras that exposed the horror of legalized racism. 70 years later, it's the cell phone camera instead of the news camera that has exposed the continuation of violence directed at African Americans by police. The sad truth is, when people told their stories of police abuse, of murder at the hands of police officers, they simply weren't believed. And even when there was videotapes, questions were asked, well, we don't know what happened before the camera went on. And then when we heard about this person that was killed, well, we really questioned their background and maybe they had a police record. Even if that was the case, what happened to arresting somebody and what happened to the presumption of innocence before proven guilty? It has taken technology and active citizen involvement to document and expose this ugly reality in our country. But just understanding the problem is not enough. We need fundamental change. And that's why Chairman Nadler and I, along with 227 co-sponsors, introduced the Justice in Policing Act. This bold, transformative legislation will assist police departments to change the culture of policing, raise the standards of the profession, and hold those officers accountable who fail to uphold the ethic of serving and protecting their communities. I don't need to repeat what's in the bill. You all know, and we'll hear about it throughout the day, but I'm certain that police officers, one part of the bill, want to be free to intervene and stop an officer for using deadly force when it's not necessary. You might have heard about the officer in New York who intervened last year when one of her colleagues had a person in a chokehold, and she was afraid that this individual was going to kill, this police officer was going to kill the person. It was an African-American woman, and she intervened and she stopped him from using the chokehold. Well, she got fired. So I believe that most police officers would have rendered aid like she did and would have stopped what happened. And I believe that police officers want to be trained in the best practices in policing. So to help support officers, this legislation will create the first ever national accreditation standards for the operation of police departments. National standards for officers. When I met with the Fraternal Order of Police, they requested this and said that they had been trying to get those national standards for years, but they were doing it in a retail manner. And if we're able to pass this legislation with teeth in it, that it will help them. But despite our best intentions, we know that there'll be some officers who cross the line. And that's why the bill also includes strong accountability measures, both as a matter of simple justice, but also to keep unfit officers off the street. A profession where you have the power to kill should be a profession that requires highly trained officers who are accountable to the public. Our country is at a crossroads now. For the first time, I believe America is finally beginning to question, to learn, and to understand the hard truths that surround policing in our country. I always say that one of the things that is most painful to African Americans is when we describe our interactions with police and when our experience is completely rejected because someone else has not had that experience. To hear people say, well, I've always had positive interactions with the police, so your interactions, I don't believe they actually happened. Right now, the world is witnessing the birth of a new movement in our country, and this movement has spread to many nations around the world. People are marching to demand not just change, but transformative change that ends police brutality, that ends racial profiling. They're marching to demand meaningful and substantive change, not a fig leaf, not reform life, and I don't want this committee to do that either. That's why we must support the Justice in Policing Act that will be changed today, and it will be called the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. People don't want to see their efforts watered down. As I said last week, if this legislation had been the law of the land several years ago, Eric Garner and George Floyd would be alive because the bill bans chokeholds. If the bill had been law last year, Breonna Taylor would not have been shot to death 12 times in her sleep because no-knock warrants for drug arrests would have been illegal. And if the National Registry had been in effect, it would have revealed that the officer who killed the 12-year-old child, Tamir Rice, had been fired from another department and had a propensity for violence. He never would have been rehired by another department, and this May, Tamir Rice would have graduated from high school. When society doesn't invest in communities, police officers are left to pick up the pieces. And police officers are the first to say that this is unfair, that they were not trained to be social workers or health providers. Homelessness, mental illness, and substance abuse are health and economic problems. In Los Angeles, we have a jail called the Twin Towers. There's hundreds of inmates in that jail. And in Los Angeles, we refer to it as the nation's most expensive mental health institution because the majority of the people in that jail suffer from mental illness. So this didn't happen overnight. 30 years ago in 1990, I started an organization in South Central Los Angeles to address a health and economic problem that society was choosing to criminalize. That was the problem with crack cocaine. And what we did, we didn't expand drug treatment. We just incarcerated people. Many of those people are in prison today. The Justice and Policing Act reinvests in our communities and empowers them to shape the future of public safety through grants and community-based organizations to develop innovative solutions. Over the years after 1990, I watched as the federal and state governments slowly divested from communities, reduced resources for services, and then we had to increase resources for prisons and for police. So we're at a crossroads in our society, and we have to decide, is the way we're going to proceed, is every time there is a health, a social, and an economic problem, is our solution going to be to solve the health, social, and economic problem, or is it going to be to spend more and more and more money expanding police departments and building prisons? Again, I support the police officers, and I support their cry when they say, when you don't fix society's problems, you leave us to pick up the pieces. That is unfair to them. They're not trained to do that, and it doesn't solve problems. We all want to be safe in our communities. We all want the police to come to our rescue when we're in trouble. We all support the brave men and women who put their lives on the line every day for us. And when we interact with police, we all want and expect to be treated with respect, not suspicion. And we should not be in fear of our life when interacting with officers. It took me many years to get over the fear of those lights coming on behind you. Not fear that I was going to get a ticket, but fear that my interaction with police might result in me not surviving. This is not just an issue for black men. This is an issue for black women as well. Millions of people in this country and around the world are marching and raising their voices to call out for effective police reform. We are here to answer those calls, and today is an opportunity, and it's an opportunity to reimagine public safety so that it is just and equitable for all Americans. And I am hopeful that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, when I hear that many of our proposals have been incorporated in what I hear is coming out of the Senate in a different way, not as strong, not as powerful, but it makes me feel like there is a pathway for us to do this. And the American people are waiting for us, and the whole world is watching us. I yield back the balance of my time.
I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, Civil Liberties, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing has become clear throughout our nation over the past several weeks, and that is that Americans have looked to this committee to lead in working together, regardless of party affiliation, to find common ground on the issues before us today. Our constituents and all the people of this country expect and deserve that. In my opening remarks at our hearing last week, I and others made clear the willingness of Republicans to work with the Democrat majority here on this committee to find meaningful solutions that will help build trust in our communities and restore faith in our institutions. I think we all agree on at least 3 core concepts. Improvements are needed in transparency, training, and termination policies for those rare bad apples in law enforcement who violate the law and the legitimacy that upholds the character of our legal system. At the same time, Congress has to be careful to uphold the respect and appreciation that is due to every American patriot who faithfully serves us in law enforcement on that thin blue line. We have 2 big problems with all of this today. First, a growing percentage of the Democrat and progressive base, and even some liberal members of Congress and mayors and city council persons, are calling for the defunding of American police. This is pure insanity. Every day in America, our law enforcement officers are putting their own lives on the line to protect our communities from violent crimes and home invasions and property theft and sex trafficking rings and vicious gang violence and drug cartels and domestic terrorism. It was noted yesterday that in 2018 alone, the police in our country arrested nearly 12,000 people for murder, 25,000 people for rape, and nearly 1.5 million for assault. Who will do all this if we dismantle and dissolve our police departments? This is a recipe for disaster, and every reasonable person can see that. And it's a proposal that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. The second big problem we have today is with this broken process and the flawed product that it has produced. While this bill has some important and wise provisions, we all agree, the legislation that's been presented for our markup here is not the result of any deliberative legislative proceedings at all. In spite of the fact that we have clear bipartisan consensus on the need for meaningful reforms and a rare opportunity to set an example of working together across party lines for the best interests of all Americans, the Democrat majority has so far locked us out of the room and instead produced a bill that includes provisions which will have a net negative impact on communities that are most affected by crime and on the safety of the officers who put their lives on the line to serve them. I serve as the ranking member on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties Subcommittee, which has jurisdiction over some of the key areas addressed by this legislation. But the bill we're considering was released just 10 days ago, and my subcommittee, which could have been an ideal venue to build consensus here, has been afforded zero opportunity to meet and consider the complex issues and specific constitutional questions before us. So my colleagues and I will introduce some key amendments today to try to repair and improve this bill. I hope they'll be duly considered and adopted by our friends on the other side. What we need right now, and again, what the American people deserve, is a thoughtful dialogue, common sense, and valuable input from both the majority and the minority on this committee. This common ground is key if we're going to accomplish the goal of keeping our communities safe, upholding the civil liberties of individuals, and protecting the legitimacy of law enforcement. In the Rose Garden yesterday, President Trump signed his executive order on safe policing for safe communities, and he mentioned in his remarks, quote, "Americans know the truth. Without police, there is chaos. Without law, there is anarchy. Without safety, there is catastrophe. We need leaders at every level of government who have the moral clarity to state these obvious facts. Americans believe we must support the brave men and women in blue who police our streets and keep us safe. Americans also believe we must improve accountability, increase transparency, and invest more resources in police training, recruiting, and community engagement. Reducing crime and raising standards are not opposite goals. They are not mutually exclusive. They work together," unquote. The President has done his part, and now we must do ours. I pray that we can work together now at this important moment for our country to solve these pressing problems. Thank you, and I yield back.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7120, offered by Mr. Nadler of New York. Strike all after the enacting.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I will now recognize myself to explain the amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute would first and foremost change the bill's short title to the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020. This is a fitting tribute to Mr. Floyd, whose tragic death sparked a worldwide movement in support of the reforms contained in this bill. I urge my colleagues to honor his memory by supporting this amendment and the underlying legislation. We know that there are countless other victims of police violence, and their tragedies are reflected in this bill as well. The amendment also makes a number of technical and conforming changes, as well as a limited number of changes to clarify and strengthen existing authorities in H.R. 7120. Among other provisions, the amendment would strike the death penalty from the sentences currently permitted under 18 U.S.C. 242, which makes it a crime for a person acting under color of any law to willfully deprive a person of a right or privilege protected by the Constitution or laws of the United States. It would clarify the qualified immunity section so that it is more clearly focused on law enforcement personnel and includes federal law enforcement officers. It would strengthen pattern and practice investigations, particularly by state attorneys general. It would clarify the operation of the police misconduct registry to make clear that information concerning misconduct by police officers involving misuse of force and racial profiling will be made public. And it would limit the use of facial recognition technology in connection with body camera and dash cam police footage required under this legislation. I urge all the members to support the manager's amendment as well as the underlying bill. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for any comments he may have on the amendment. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
I'd like to strike
Ms.
the last word.
Jackson-Lee is recognized for purposes of striking the last word.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much. Thank you for the leadership of this committee. Thank you to the chairwoman and the Congressional Black Caucus and all of the members who have gathered here for a significant day in the history of the United States of America. I think the real question has to be, what is the value of black lives? Are black lives valued? Is a black life valued? Are all black lives valued? Living in the skin that I live in for obviously all of my life, being around my family members and others in the community, I realize that that question has never been answered by this nation. And it's difficult to hear the rejection of the understanding of the systemic call of racism that has plagued every aspect of our society. And so what we do today is a message that Dr. King gave us some many years ago, that he might not be able to change hearts, but he can change laws. The sadness I feel today is mixed with joy, because if we had passed these bills that we had worked on over a decade ago, if after our visit as a Judiciary Committee to New York after the killing of Abdou Diallo, if we had moved on legislation that we had been filing for years and years, yes, lives would be saved. If we had been able to move on the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act that was named after George Floyd about 10 days ago, we might have been able to enhance the words protect and serve. And at the same time, we would have said to the nation that we mourn any loss of any law enforcement, but we would have been able maybe to keep more of them alive. And yes, we would have seen black boys go home to their mothers, like Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Michael Brown, and Laquan McDonald, shot many times in his back. I am grateful for where we are today, and I'm grateful on behalf of the George Floyd family. What a wonderful and provocative and important statement Mr. Floyd made. They're under so much pressure. They're under so much loss. Their pain is so deep. We see it every day in our community. We're still praying and showing up in front of various recognitions of George Floyd, paintings, murals. And I remember that one thing that Mr. Floyd said in this hearing room, he wanted justice. When I told him that our efforts to name this bill after his brother were successful, the work that we did collectively together to get it named, and it is in this manager's amendment, he thanked us publicly yesterday in Houston. And so what we have to deal with now is to recognize that Dr. King's words were correct. We have to change laws in order to change hearts, And he was further correct when he said now is the time and why we can't wait. We can't wait in Houston because we know the story of Jose Torres and Ida Lee Delaney, Danny Ray Thomas, Pamela Turner, and so many others that have never been in the line of justice, but they lost their life. But as the world saw a man's life seep out on the streets of America, they said no more. And I am grateful that we have in this legislation the end racial profiling, so it becomes law that you cannot racially profile African Americans, the descendants of enslaved Africans. We celebrate this week, Juneteenth, that recognizes that we are the only group, African Americans, that have been in bondage in this nation. There is not anguish, there is patriotism. We've served our country. And so the value of this patriotic legislation is that we're moving beyond conversation. We can't have any more conversations. We're ending racial profiling. We're affirming civilian review boards, funding them as an accreditation process and giving them subpoena power. What an amazing step toward opportunity and justice. And so I would say, as we continue this debate, I too seek the partnership and friendship of my fellow Americans. They may wear the label of Republicans, but they are friends. They are friends because I mourn too the loss of Chairman Sensenbrenner's wife, who I've traveled with as well. I express my sympathy to Mr. Barr as well. That is the human decency in which we must operate. And it is to this moment that we say to America that African Americans, that Black Americans deserve the same human decency and recognition of their humanity as anyone else. I ask the question, does Black Lives Matter? I think today we'll stop the conversation and we'll continue to answer it by passing this legislation. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. I want to recognize the presence here of our former colleague, the White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows. For what purpose does Mr. Armstrong seek recognition?
At the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7120, offered by Mr. Armstrong of North Dakota. Add at the end of the bill the following and conform the table of contents accordingly.
Without objection. Mr. Chairman, this is a pretty simple amendment. This requires that the DOJ law enforcement record audioly all interviews that are conducted, whether they are in custody or non-custodial. There's some narrow exceptions for confidential informants, and there are retention requirements for 10 years or, in the case of capital cases or other, until the case is disposed of legally. And this is an important amendment, and if our goal is to hold law enforcement accountable and improve transparency, and indeed we do, because in subtitle C we require federal uniformed law enforcement to carry body cameras and dash cameras. But even as this bill introduced, if it would pass, there's a perverse incentive which exists where immediately upon that person being being arrested or detained and turned over for an interview, there would be absolutely no requirement for that body camera to stay on or for any recording device to exist. I think it's time that our premier law enforcement agencies get into the 21st century. All the arguments in the past that have been used for not recording interviews just simply don't exist. It was too expensive. It was too cumbersome. It doesn't allow for the free flow of conversation. Well, we know that's not the case. And we know that because ostensibly the FBI said so in a 2004 memo. And again, the DOJ did in a 2014 memo, in which in both memos they required that in-custody interviews be either audibly or visually recorded. The problem is in custody becomes an interesting term of art when we're dealing with our friends in federal law enforcement. The FBI and DOJ, in custody only applies following arrest and prior to the initial appearance when the defendant is in a place of detention with suitable recording equipment. Because apparently federal law enforcement is the only group of people in the world that don't know how to use a smartphone. Interrogations can often last for hours, and notes cannot account for everything. Furthermore, trials often happen years after those interviews. making it ridiculous to believe that agents can cognitively recall specific details if they are not recorded. And sometimes, unfortunately, agents feel compelled to lie, or they feel compelled to threaten their suspects. But when those same witnesses or subjects lie back, they are often charged with a crime or their plea deal is revoked. And we know this has happened. We have seen it in high-profile cases. In the Michael Flynn case, there were 2 different 302s that were filed. And 302s really, they take on this air of federal authority. Here's what a 302 is. It's an officer's note. It's an officer's view of a transcript. You can give it a name, you can give it an official federal title, but that's all it is. And the first one was filed 3.5 weeks after the interview, which is absolutely ridiculous in and of itself. Remember, can you recall a conversation you had 3.5 weeks earlier, regardless of what you were doing? But the more troubling fact in this entire thing is the second one was 3.5 months later. 3.5 months later, the redacted and revised 302 was filed. That shouldn't have happened. Those interviews should have been recorded. In the Paul Manafort case, in February of 2019, Judge Jackson held a hearing in that case to deal with lying law enforcement. And we know exactly what happened in that hearing because there's a transcript of it. Unfortunately, we don't know what happened in the 12 interviews that they conducted with Paul Manafort because there's not a transcript of any of them. And that isn't done by accident. That isn't done out of convenience. That is done intentionally. And so during that hearing, the judge ultimately sided with the prosecution in that case. But she said on the record, this is a problem with not having grand jury testimony, but having to look at the 302. I may not be able to resolve it on its face of the 302. And you know what? She shouldn't have to. Recorded interviews protect law enforcement. They protect criminal defendants. They reduce burdens on the court system as they reduce jury trials. And probably most importantly today, they increase public trust in law enforcement. And that's something we drastically need at this point in time. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We'd like to examine this amendment further. If the gentleman will withdraw the amendment, we'll work with the gentleman to see if we can fit it in on the way to the Rules Committee. Will the gentleman withdraw the amendment so that we can work it, we can examine it further on the way to the Rules Committee?
Not at this time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks
Mr.
recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Rhode Island.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
I want to begin also with expressions of sympathy to Mr. Sensenbrenner on the loss of his beloved wife, Cheryl, and we all will keep him in our prayers and thoughts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your extraordinary leadership that brings us to this markup today. I'd also like to recognize the magnificent leadership of Congresswoman Karen Bass, the chair of the Crime Subcommittee and the Congressional Black Caucus on this historic legislation. Before we convene this morning, my thoughts turn to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Nearly a year ago to the day before he was gunned down in April of 1967, Dr. King visited my district in Rhode Island for an address on civil rights. I haven't lost faith in the future, King said that Sunday morning, but I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism or of racial inequality. More than 50 years later, we're here once again because of the madness of racial inequality. In our country, black people are more than 5 times as likely as whites to be arrested for the mere suspicion of a crime. The police are nearly 4 times as likely to use force when confronting a black suspect. And black men are 2.5 times as likely as white men to be killed by a police officer. The fact is, our criminal justice system so often victimizes people of color because it's built on a foundation of racism that was laid while the Civil War was still being fought. In January 1865, Congress passed a joint resolution proposing a 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution to outlaw slavery. But while the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, it replaced it with a new system of racial control that allowed black people to be arrested on minor offenses and put to work as unpaid laborers as punishment. We are still living with the legacy of that decision today. The imprisonment rate for black people is more than 5 times the rate among white people. The prison industrial complex has devastated generations of black men and women through Jim Crow, the war on drugs, and the continued harassment, intimidation, and killing of black men, women, and children today. The killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Rashard Brooks, and so many more Black Americans are just the latest in the long line of modern-day lynchings that cry out for justice. It is our solemn responsibility to finally correct the painful injustices of the past 155 years. We must pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act because George Floyd mattered and because Black lives matter. First, this bill makes it easier to hold bad cops accountable for their actions. It removes barriers to prosecution and recovering damages from officers who violate a person's civil rights. The doctrine of qualified immunity has created a system where it's virtually impossible to get justice for victims of police misconduct and racial bias. A system where an officer of the peace can escape liability by virtue of his badge and gun is a system that must end. Never again should an officer feel empowered to choke the life out of an unarmed Black man whose crime was selling loose cigarettes. Never again should an officer shoot and kill an unarmed Black man in the back as he runs away. We need to end the era of police officers behaving and looking like troops in a combat zone. And that's why the Justice and Policing Act takes steps to demilitarize police departments. Without trust, police cannot do their jobs. And it's hard to build trust when at first glance a law enforcement officer looks more like an occupying soldier. We need police departments to be trusted institutions in our community and the officers and advocates for the people who live there. To that end, this bill increases transparency while encouraging departments to meet a gold standard in training, hiring, and de-escalation strategies. It establishes the first ever national database of civilian police encounters, including the use of force and traffic stops, and requires the collection, analysis, and release of such data. It also requires the collection of data on police misconduct to track and prevent bad cops from moving from one department to another to avoid accountability. It addresses systemic racism and bias by cracking down on racial and religious profiling. It bans the use of chokeholds and no-knock warrants like those used on George Floyd, Eric Garner, and Breonna Taylor. Taking these steps will help save lives, ensure accountability, and improve public safety. All of us here today know that we can do better in this country. We can end the systemic racism in policing. We can and must do that. Our communities deserve this, and so do the overwhelming number of officers who do their jobs professionally and with honor every day. But as Dr. King reminded us at another speech in Rhode Island in October of 1966, the appalling silence of the good people is as serious as the vitriolic words of the bad people. So my colleagues, do not be silent. Rise to this moment. Set aside politics. Join us in fixing what is broken in America, and we'll be able to look back on this day and know that together we made a difference. And as George Floyd's brother reminded us, your names will become famous too, like his brother, if you in fact do the right thing and respond to racial injustice in this country. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Gates seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I wrote it down. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Republicans will not support the defunding of police, the dismantling of police, the demonizing of police. We will not turn our streets over to the Chaz warlords, though some have, and perhaps even others in the United States Congress would. It's hard not to note, as we gathered here, the extent to which death hangs over this committee hearing. The death of spouses of two of our colleagues in recent days, the death of Mr. Floyd, Pat's death, the death of law enforcement officers that seek to keep our communities safe, the death of those who otherwise have passed in these riots. Leaders bring life into meaningful reforms, and I think that's what we have the opportunity to do today. And I wanted to congratulate the bill sponsor on bringing together some ideas that give me hope that we can breathe life into meaningful reform. The President has unquestionably led on these issues. The President's executive order yesterday builds upon the hearing that we had last week. It builds upon the themes that were developed, the evidence that was presented, and I'm grateful that President Trump didn't wait around to take action, that he took action immediately on issues like chokeholds, bad cops, and databases that can inform more sound policing. I believe even more can be done. I believe that the reforms on no-knock warrants have merit. I believe that there are some immunities that we can look at to ensure that policing is improved. And I'm hopeful that my Democrat colleagues will undertake the spirit of reform in a bipartisan way and will view our suggestions as offered in good faith. The gentleman from North Dakota's amendment unquestionably is offered in good faith, and I'd like to speak about it for a moment. There is no excuse for federal law enforcement in this country not to take a recording of an interview so that we are not left questioning people's different characterizations and memories from these interviews. I believe that the legislation on body cameras is very productive, but if we can move policing into the 21st century on body cameras, can we at least move the federal government entities that we control into the 20th century? Can we at least ensure that we don't have another circumstance like the Russia hoax, where as a consequence of federal agents who had well exceeded their authority as law enforcement officers when they became political actors, when they wanted to deprive the people of this country of the duly elected president, when they took interviews and then characterized them falsely, politically. We didn't have recordings to go back to in all of those circumstances. And if these things can happen to General Flynn, if they can happen to people working on a presidential campaign, I can only imagine the number of times where the FBI might have had someone in an interview and the lack of a recording allowed the government to deprive people of their rights, to characterize things inaccurately. And so I know that Republicans are motivated to adopt the gentleman's amendment in large part because we saw the devastating consequences of the lack of a clear record in the Russia hoax, and it was very embarrassing for the Congress. I presume it might have been embarrassing for many of you when the facts finally came out in that case. But I think it's demonstrative to the broader point that if our desire is to improve policing and to create better balance in the relationship that police have with those they're serving, this is undoubtedly a good amendment. I'll conclude with this. If the overall theme is to keep police engaged and proactive in their communities, you're going to find the president and Republicans in Congress very willing to work with the Democrat majority in the House on those issues. However, if the goal is to keep the cop in the car, if the goal is to have police so stripped of all immunities, so deprived of all of the use of force that they might need to preserve their own lives, if the goal is to have police essentially on a level playing field with cartels and criminals when it comes to their equipment, then we would be unable to support that, because that would be the manifestation of an effort to defund, dismantle, and demoralize the police, not an effort to improve the police. We want to reform, we want to improve, we want to work together, and we hope our Democrat colleagues will take this amendment and others that are offered in good faith, and that you'll speak out against the dangerous efforts to demoralize those who are serving us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Goldman.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose is Ms. McBaskey recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. And I want to offer my deepest condolences to our colleague, Mr. Sensenbrenner, and the loss of his wife. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairwoman Bass, for really doing such good work, so timely, and really needed. These past few months have given us just too much to fear, too many lives to mourn. We have lost loved ones to a virus we've never experienced before, and we've lost loved ones to the racism that has plagued our nation for centuries, the racism that took my son, Jordan, from me. But our strength as a nation has always come in our ability to come together to address our greatest challenges. We are coming together as we check on our neighbors with pre-existing conditions who can't go to the store. We are coming together as we march against injustice. Today, we come together to honor the life of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, and we're doing it with action. And for that, I am completely filled with hope. This bill will strengthen our communities, restore trust in law enforcement, and ensure the safety of every American. This bill will save lives. I've been thinking a lot about Psalm 34:17 lately, and it says that when the righteous cry out for help, The Lord hears and delivers them out of all of their troubles. The righteous are crying out, and they are marching and demanding justice. And we hear you, and we see you. So many of our officers nationwide are truly upholding their duty to protect and serve. They have the trust of their communities and, as a result, are better at ensuring everyone's safety. These officers know the people that they serve. They see them as brothers and sisters and neighbors, and their departments reflect the diversity of their communities. We do have officers who serve with honor, who respect the dignity of every citizen. This bill is about making sure that every officer and every department is held to the high standard set by officers like these. It does that by ending racial and religious profiling, because everyone deserves to be treated equally under the law. This bill invests in community-oriented policing. In my district in Georgia, the 6th District, our officers know that they must earn the respect of those that they serve, and they do earn it. Last weekend, I walked with families, community leaders, city officials, preachers, and police officers in a solidarity march through Roswell, Georgia. I walked with Pastor Lee Jenkins and Roswell Police Chief James Conroy. We prayed together as a community. We talked about rebuilding and strengthening the trust that keeps our community safe. We talked about where do we go from here and how every one of us has a role to play. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act reflects a spirit that affirms that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and viewed equally in the eyes of the law. This bill underscores our commitment to community-oriented policing that promotes everyone's safety and ensures accountability for those who fail to uphold their duty to protect us. And it rewards cities that are finding new ways to promote public safety. I am very proud of how we have come together as a nation, finally come together as a nation to work towards these solutions. And I am really filled with hope for the first time. I am truly filled with hope that these actions that we take today, these collaborations, Republicans and Democrats together, will truly save lives. I know that there are kinks to work out, and I know that there are amendments to be made. But this step that we take today is a first step in truly creating the culture of safety and preservation of life that people in this country are crying out for. We have a responsibility and accountability, and dare we not do what needs to be done. This is 400 years overdue. Let's stand in the gap and do what has to be done for all of our citizens in America. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Gomert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Comment was made earlier that we don't want this bill weakened, and I'm not aware of any Republican that has an amendment that would weaken the bill. We would like to make it stronger and deeply regret that we were not consulted to help make this a truly bipartisan bill coming out of the gate. There's an awful lot of people on our side of the aisle who understand we need to make the law better and should. And many of us have worked in law enforcement, spent many years in it, and have good insights. So the process we're left to is amendments. And my friend Mr. Armstrong has a good amendment here. The only issue I have with anything that he said or in the amendment is when he said we need to bring the federal authorities into the 21st century. As my friend Mr. Gates pointed out, if we could just bring the FBI into the 20th century, it's a big help. And for anyone who knows that there is still some racism in law enforcement, I would contend it's a tiny percentage, but it's still there. We've seen it. Allowing the FBI to simply write down their version of what is said by a witness instead of doing what every cop on the street knows needs to be done, and that's a recording of what is said, the FBI is going to be able, either by faulty memory or by intent, sway the manner in which a witness's statement is portrayed and what is said is portrayed. That shouldn't be allowed. I mean, the FBI, until recent years, was considered by most of us to be the preeminent law enforcement department or agency in the world. That has been sorely blemished. I don't think Christopher Wray's helped at all. But this would go a long way toward preventing any officer, any FBI agent, any federal officer who has ill intent from being able to carry that out, because the statement is a matter of record. It would be recorded. It would be, it could not be edited. It would have to be played as it was, and that would help eliminate even the temptation of any federal officer to be less than candid in efforts to recall what was said by a witness that could mean the difference between many, many years in prison or being the free person that he or she should be. So I hope that we can come together. This would have been a great provision to have in the bill, and it would have been suggested and encouraged if we'd been consulted before the bill was brought forward. So I really hope we can come together on this. There's no reason not to have federal officers as proficient and accurate as local law enforcement in some of the smallest counties in the country. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized.
And I also want to express condolences to the Sensenbrenner family and the Barr family, the tragic losses that they've endured in the last 48 hours. It was powerful testimony that we received right in this well last week from Mr. Floyd and Mr. Underwood's sister. And we have continued to see in this country individual and institutional tragedies that must move us to act, otherwise they will persist. And we are not helpless. People in the streets, they feel helpless. They feel that they're not being listened to. But we're not helpless. We are elected to represent them and to bring the change that they are calling for. But I think it's important for us to kind of calibrate where all of us are at, because it sounds like my colleagues on the other side want to welcome and embrace and work with us on needed police reforms. Not to say that all cops are bad cops, but that we're seeing too many exceptions today. I say that as the son of a police chief, the brother to 2 police officers, and a former prosecutor myself. Things have to change. And no one's talking about, in this bill, defunding the police. We're talking about policing the police and fixing the police and reforming the police. But when I say we need to calibrate where we are all at, I've heard a lot of my colleagues on this side say Black Lives Matter. And I'll be honest that when that movement first emerged, I didn't necessarily understand what that meant. I heard people say all lives matter, and I thought, well, yeah, all lives matter, right? People would say, well, you have a white privilege, and I thought, well, you know, I grew up living in 13 different houses, going to 11 different schools, first in my family to go to college, that there was no privilege there. And then it was explained to me by my African American friends that even though you and so many others may have had hardships, your opportunity was not limited because of the color of your skin. That's what people say when they talk about a white privilege, which is real and should be acknowledged. The founder of Black Lives Matter, Alicia Garza, says, Black Lives Matter doesn't mean your life isn't important. It means that black lives, which are seen as without value within white supremacy, are important to your liberation. Given the disproportionate impact state violence has on black lives, we understand that when black people in this country get free, the benefits will be wide-reaching and transformative for society as a whole. When we are able to end the hypercriminalization and sexualization of black people and end the poverty, control, and surveillance of black people, every single person in this world has a better shot at getting and staying free. When black people get free, everybody gets free. Black lives matter, period. And so I would yield to any of my colleagues on the Republican side who can unequivocally say, as we calibrate where we are right now, that black lives matter.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Does the gentleman believe that all lives matter as well? I think black lives matter. I think all lives matter.
Reclaiming my time. Can anyone on the Republican side say unequivocally black lives matter?
Unequivocally, all lives matter. Why is that a problem to acknowledge?
Reclaiming my time. I think it's clear that my colleagues on the other side would like to put up a straw man to not have the uncomfortable conversation that we need to have about race. Typically, in police shootings, most of the focus is on the conduct of the officer, and we never get to the harder part about the systemic issues we have in our country. Nobody is disputing that what the officer did here with Mr. Floyd should be defended. So we have to have the harder conversation about systemic issues in policing. Instead, we get this straw man of, well, you're trying to defund the police. Nowhere in this legislation is anyone seeking to defund the police. So until you're willing to get rid of the straw man, get rid of the confusion, get rid of all of the different tactics you're using to avoid the hard conversation about race in America, we are not going to get where we need to be to have equality, not just in policing, but in healthcare, in jobs, in education.
Will the gentleman
Black lives matter. I'm
I
sad
can say
to say no one on the other
black
side
lives
will say
do
it.
matter, unequivocally. Black lives do
And
matter.
I'll yield to Mr.
Every life is precious, God-given, and black lives matter, unequivocally. Every life is important.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the gentleman from North Dakota's amendment. It's a good amendment. And the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, is right on target. Cops wear body cams, but the FBI agent interviewing a three-star general doesn't have to record that conversation? That makes no sense, especially when you know the facts around that conversation that took place. Remember, in January of 2017, January 4th, 2017, the agents on the Michael Flynn case, three-star general, served our country for over 30 years. The agents on the case said, we want to drop this case. There's nothing here. They didn't want to pursue it. But what happened? The director of the FBI told Peter Strzok to tell the agents, no, 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 don't drop the case. We're going after Michael Flynn. The next day, January 5th, 2017, Jim Comey meets with then President Obama and talks about Michael Flynn. And what happens 19 days later? What happens 19 days later? These agents, not my words, Jim Comey's words, these agents are snuck into the White House. Mr. Comey doesn't follow the proper protocols, the proper process. He doesn't notify the White House counsel. He sneaks them in to set up Michael Flynn. And there's no recording of that interview. There's the 302 notes. And guess what they do with the notes? They change them months later and prosecute a general, prosecute an American citizen based on that. And all the gentleman's asking is, let's fix that. Let's at least have an audio recording of that conversation that took place. And the Democrats say, we need to study it. What? Let's just pass it. That is as Mr. Gates said, let's get with the times.
Let's get with the times. We're doing a virtual hearing. We can't even see half the Democrats who are supposed to be on the screen participating. We can't even see that. But somehow the FBI can interview people, American citizens, charge them with something that turns out not to be a crime. We know there was nothing there because the Justice Department said there's nothing there. They're dropping the case. And you guys want to study making an audio recording of those type of interviews. This is as basic and simple and straightforward as it gets. The gentleman from North Dakota knows what he's talking about. He has worked in this area. So let's adopt this amendment, common sense, thoughtful, good amendment that needs to happen, particularly in light of what we have lived through the last 3 years, what we have now learned took place. This is as straightforward as it gets. And I would urge adoption of the amendment. I'm happy to yield the remaining 2 minutes to my colleague from Florida if he still seeks some time.
I thank the gentleman. I would just comment that in the effort that we're here on to offer amendments like the gentleman from North Dakota that would apply to all Americans equally, as we're here to craft legislation, like the theatrics of serving us up the question on a political theme seem to be a bit misplaced. I mean, it would be as if I were willing to yield to any Democrat willing to say that blue lives matter, right? Not super productive. So I think if we acknowledge that all lives matter, that there are definitely problems in our society that we have to solve, that Congresswoman Bass has put together some very compelling ideas that we should evaluate in good faith, that the president has already acted on some of Congresswoman Bass's ideas and by trying to get to the root of these challenges and these problems. I hope that would be the way we would continue the hearing. I yield back to the gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleagues, we are here today for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Charlene Lyles, Manny Ellis, John T. Williams, and all the names that we'll never know whose lives were cut short by police. We are here to answer the cries for justice we've heard in the streets across the country with this bill, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, a bill that the New York Times has called the most aggressive intervention into policing by Congress in recent memory. And I'm very grateful to you, Chairman Nadler, and to Congresswoman Bass for your hard work to bring this bill forward. In my district, people of color are 30% more likely to have police point a firearm at them than white people. Seattle is 7% black, and yet black people accounted for nearly 29% of the incidents of use of force. We have been under a consent decree for 8 years, and while we've made some important progress, the truth is that we are far from finished, and the immediate use of force on the streets to the peaceful protesters in recent weeks show us the work that we still need to do. What we see locally tracks nationally. A November 2019 report by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights found an increased likelihood of police use of force against people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQ people, people with mental health concerns, people with low incomes, and those at the intersections of these groups. USCCR also found a troubling lack of data on the issue, a problem that leaves us piecing together reports in order to understand the depth of the problem that so many black and brown people across the country already know to be true. Mapping Police Violence found only 27 days in 2019 where police did not kill someone, and black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. And stunningly, nationally, officers were not charged with a crime in 99% of the killings by police from 2013 to 2019. Is it any wonder then that tens of thousands of people across the country are heartbroken and furious that we have not done sufficient work or really anything to address these grave injustices and the constant loss of life with no accountability? The Justice and Policing Act is a crucial step forward to begin addressing centuries-old pervasive violence against the black community and communities of color. The bill bans chokeholds like the ones used to murder George Floyd and Manny Ellis in my home state. It establishes them as a civil rights violation, bans no-knock warrants for drug cases like the one that was used when officers murdered Breonna Taylor. It establishes a public police misconduct registry that tracks complaints at the local, state, and federal level. and it adopts accountability measures like reforming qualified immunity. It improves data collection by requiring the reporting of all incidents of use of force, stops and searches, and the demographics of those involved. And importantly, the bill provides grants for Black and brown communities across the country to reimagine how we ensure community safety for everyone, so that Black mothers and fathers do not have to constantly warn their kids to stay away from police officers instead of seeking help from them. That cannot be our model. And this bill begins to make the changes that will allow for everyone, regardless of the color of their skin, to be safe. Some in the media and even some of my colleagues on this committee would like to change our focus from these essential reforms to things like digitally altered pictures on Fox News that spread lies about what is happening in my district, where community members have come together to plant community gardens and re-envision public safety, bringing much needed peace to an area that has long been the center of activism. Do not be distracted. Let us keep our focus on what is in this bill and what Philonise Floyd demanded we do, to not allow George Floyd to simply be a picture on a t-shirt. The Justice in Policing Act says to the families of George Floyd and so many others, the wrongful deaths of your loved ones will not be in vain. We must listen and respond to the calls of Black organizers, advocates, and civil rights leaders across our districts and countries, and do the long culture-shifting work to change how we approach public safety. Too often, our police
20 seconds.
are on the front lines responding to decades of defunding of things that people really need: mental health, housing, education, reforming a broken criminal justice system, and so much more. That is part and parcel of what we must fix. It is not enough to say Black Lives Matter. We must do the work to cement this essential principle into policy and practice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Buck.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Swalwell, I want to state unequivocally that I believe Black Lives Matter. And I also want to state unequivocally that I recognize that you have lived a privileged life. And I also want to welcome you and so many others on your side of the aisle to the pro-life movement. I keep hearing about the sanctity of life, and I think it is time that we deal with this issue and that we find common ground on other issues. And protecting life from conception to natural death is essential to the dignity of people in this country, and I welcome my friends on all of those issues. I also think that it is outstanding, and I thank the gentlelady from California and the chair of the subcommittee here, Ms. Bass, for recognizing the difficulty that police officers face in their day-to-day lives, and how we as a legislative body and how state legislatures across the country have failed in dealing with mental health issues and so many other social issues, and how we place on police officers an unfair burden. And while I agree with parts of this bill, there are parts of this bill that would place an even greater burden on those police officers, the good police officers, the police officers who are protecting our young as they go back and forth to school, who are protecting our citizens as they go to the store to pick up a prescription, as they are protecting our citizens in their everyday lives. And I think it's absolutely essential that we recognize, and I thank the gentlelady for their recognition that the police officers have such a tough job. I have mentioned to my friend and colleague, Mr. Armstrong, that I can't support this amendment. I understand the compelling reason behind this amendment, and I believe that the FBI should be held accountable for the gross misconduct that it engaged in investigating the Trump campaign. I think that when we require out-of-custody interviews to be recorded, we are going to seriously limit the FBI's ability to carry out its mission in the anti-terrorism area, in the white-collar area, and so many other areas where it is very difficult to predict when an interview is going to take place, much less how to foster the best atmosphere for that interview. So I have reservations about this, but I think one of the serious failings of the Judiciary Committee in the past year and a half has been its failure to fully investigate the gross misconduct that the FBI engaged in with the Trump administration and the Trump campaign. I think when you look at the actions and what has been revealed so far in the press and in the Senate, it compels this committee to study the issue, to hold hearings on the issue, to publicize, to shine light on that misconduct, and to make sure that that misconduct doesn't happen again against a Democrat administration or a Republican administration. And it's so unfortunate that my Democrat colleagues feel it's okay to sweep something under the rug because it was the target of this investigation, the target of this misconduct were Republicans, and was somebody they don't like, President Trump. While you conducted a witch hunt, a partisan impeachment hearing, down the line in the House, down the line vote on impeachment, you can't even look at how a federal agency abused its power to engage in political activities, something that I think we all find incredibly offensive and sad that the FBI's leadership would tarnish the image and the great work that's being done by so many FBI agents. So I thank my colleague, Mr. Armstrong, for bringing this amendment. I thank him for shining light on this serious problem that we have in the FBI. And I look forward to making sure that we do everything we can to expose that behavior. And I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Mercoso-Powell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's a good opportunity for us to regroup and remind America why we are all gathered here today. We're here, like Congresswoman Bass said earlier, for fundamental change that our communities are calling for. The deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and just over the weekend, Rayshard Brooks have called pain and more division in our country. And what the people are asking for, what they're peacefully marching for, is change. All of us today have the opportunity, my colleagues, my Republican colleagues, my Democratic colleagues, we have to have the courage to confront the crisis head on. And we have the responsibility in Congress and in this committee to pass laws at the federal level that will hold law enforcement accountable for their actions and ensure that they are protecting and serving our communities. I know that we can all agree on that. My constituents in my district have overwhelmingly indicated to me that that's what they're asking for, greater accountability. My office conducted a survey last week, and we got over 1,200 responses from constituents on both sides of the aisle, different ages and races. And what were they all in agreement with? That they wanted to see greater accountability for officers that were accused of misconduct. And what have we seen? We've seen thousands of Americans from all walks of life marching together, demanding change. What the people want to see is changes in police oversight and responsibility for those who fail to uphold the law. And they want to know that the law is applied equally to everyone, every American citizen. I've witnessed from personal experience in my area that law enforcement in Miami and in my district are making changes. They are trying. I have met with them, and I commend the large number of officers who are working to serve and protect the people they serve. But accountability means transparency, and the efforts in this bill establish a national registry for police misconduct and require reporting on the use of force. We need these meaningful changes to build trust in our communities. It also means that working on the front end to reform police practices and addressing the systemic racism that is ingrained in our society and in our government. The reality is that people of color live with and face prejudice throughout their entire lives. our federal and state law enforcement agencies need to enact reforms that are responsive to the nation's pleas and that live up to the standard of equal protection under the law. We need to take action that ends racial profiling, bans chokeholds, and sets a standard that use of force should only be used as last resort. What the president signed as an executive order yesterday does not go far enough, and we've seen that when a new president takes over, they can repeal the executive order signed by previous presidents. That's why in Congress, as an independent branch of government, we need to take the responsibility to enact all of these measures into law and ensure that we ban chokeholds, not only under certain circumstances. I am proud to support the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act because it works to make all these changes. I am also proud to support this bill because it supports greater community law enforcement. This bill promotes the use of civilian oversight boards, which will build bridges between police and the communities, giving the people a voice in their policies. They ensure officer accountability through fair and open investigations and work to shape public trust in local law enforcement. Miami-Dade County is looking at the idea of reviving civilian oversight of police, but it's only effective if it's structured correctly. And that's why HR 7120 sets a baseline for effective civilian oversight, and I think more work can be done in the future to bolster their use across the country. So please, let's not get distracted by political talking points. We shouldn't be political today, members of the judiciary, all of us working together. Let's show the American people that we are going to take action, that we have the courage and the will to make sure that we hold our police departments accountable and protect the people that they're charged to serve. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Reschenthaler, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, it's gentleman, but it's okay. I understand things are fluid today. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've heard some of my colleagues try to talk about the fact that the Democrat Party does not want to defund the police. But let's just look at their own words on this matter. And this is all in the words of individuals in the Democrat Party. Brian Fallon, in early June, he's the executive director of Demand Justice. He's also the former press secretary to Hillary Clinton, and he's the spokesperson for Attorney General Eric Holder. He tweeted, quote, "Defund the police." On June 5th, Representative Omar, she represents Minneapolis, as we all know, she tweeted, and I quote, "The Minneapolis Police Department has proven themselves beyond reform. It's time to disband them and reimagine public safety in Minneapolis." Minneapolis City Council member Jeremiah Ellison, who's coincidentally the son of Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, he tweeted, and I quote, "We are going to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department. And when we're done, we're not simply going to glue it back together. We're going to dramatically rethink how we approach public safety and emergency response. It's really past due." Ellison then also publicly pledged his support to the leftist terrorist organization Antifa. Lisa Bender, president of the Minneapolis City Council, tweeted, "We're going to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department." Patrice Cullors, a co-founder of the BLM movement, wants to see police forces abolished entirely. Steve Fletcher, Minnesota Council City member, he stated that he and the city council president and the chair of public safety are calling to, and I quote, "disband our police department and start fresh with a community-oriented, nonviolent public safety and outreach capacity." And in LA, Mayor Eric Garcetti is looking to defund the police to the tune of over $250 million of cuts. So, Mr. Chairman, we constantly hear from the left that words matter. That's the mantra of the left. Well, words do matter. And the Democrats want to, and this is in their own words, the Democrats want to defund, dismantle, and abolish the police. So, Mr. Chairman, these are their words, and their words certainly matter. Now, if I could address one more point that I've heard today, I heard one of my colleagues try to minimize Chaz, the autonomous zone in Seattle, the 6 square blocks in downtown Seattle that Antifa has taken over. Well, I've heard it minimized as something like it's a peaceful protest, alluded to as something that we would see in the 60s, the Summer of Love. But let me just quote the chief of police in Seattle. Seattle Police Chief Carmen Best said, and I quote, "Rapes, robberies, and all sorts of violent acts have been occurring in the area, and we're not able to get to them," unquote. So before we minimize Chaz, think about that. Rape, robberies, and all sorts of violent acts. So let's call this for what it is. It's a terrorist organization that has taken over 6 city blocks in Seattle, a quote-unquote autonomous zone, and Seattle and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are minimizing this behavior and allowing rapes, robberies, and all sorts of acts to occur under the name of quote-unquote peaceful protests. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield to my friend and colleague from North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate Mr. Buck's comments, and I think this is where we're at. This type of reform is really hard, and it's really hard to do well, and not all differences are ideological. He's a prosecutor. I'm a defense attorney. I would be more susceptible to his argument if the FBI hasn't systemically circumvented what they consider a custodial versus a non-custodial interview for well over a decade. But also with that, in that regard, we are asking state and local departments from the federal government to do a lot of things. And we are dictating how to do a lot of things. At the very least we could do when we do that is what we have said is require basic technology and fundamental fairness with what is supposed to be the premier law enforcement agencies in the country. And to Mr. Chairman's point about going to rules, I was in rules during FISA-Rioth, and I watched Ms. Lofgren's amendment die in some black hole that I don't get to be in the room when that vote happens. That's why we're here. We need to do these things here. This is simple. And just before my time runs out, I have some unanimous consent requests. FBI memo dated 3/23/2006 titled Electronic Recording of Confessions and Witness Interviews. DOJ memo dated 5/12/2014, subject concerning electronic recordings of statements. A report by the Northwestern University School of Law Center for Wrongful Convictions in the summer of 2004, police experiences with recording custodial interrogations. The Justice Project, electronic recordings of custodial interrogations, and specifically for my friend Mr. Buck, the grand jury target, tracking key issues in white-collar prosecutions. With that, I yield back.
Without objection, the statements are accepted, and the gentleman's time has expired. And I now recognize Ms. Scanlon.
And I'd like to, may I move to strike the last word?
Gentlelady is recognized.
And could I yield briefly to Ms. Bass?
Thank you so much. I have to correct my good friend, Representative Rushenshaller, since you called out my city, Los Angeles. I will tell you that our mayor did not defund the police in Los Angeles. On any given day, we have 40,000 people who are homeless, 40,000. And so what he did was reallocate money to address the problems that the police department never wants to deal with because they shouldn't. Thank you. I yield back to the good lady.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Bass, and everyone who's worked so diligently to bring the George Floyd Justice and Policing Bill before us. We are witnessing a long overdue moral reckoning in this country, and we can't wait any longer to act. In the week since we held our last hearing, another black man has lost his life at the hands of the police when he was shot in the back in Atlanta. We have to act now. I want to thank the gentleman from North Dakota for bringing this promising bill to our attention, and I look forward to working with him on it to include it in the final bill. I appreciate his bringing his experience as a prosecutor to propose a substantive amendment.
Defense attorney.
Sorry, defense attorney. But bringing that experience in this field to us to work to make the bill better. I particularly appreciate the seriousness with which he approaches the issue of actually addressing police accountability rather than making irrelevant political arguments or suggesting toothless proposals that will not make the changes we need to dismantle systemic racism in our country. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I move to strike the last word. I move to strike the last word. Thank you. Mr. Chairman and members, I want to say that I respect Representative Bass, and I think that she works hard. There are parts of this underlying bill that I agree with, and I think there's parts of this underlying bill that most Republicans and the president could agree with. But it's disappointing that, from what I've been told, there was no reach out to Republicans to work on this bill. And so there are parts of this bill that I can't support. And the reason that I can't support it is because I talked to constituents and law enforcement officers, a wide variety of law enforcement officers, and they said portions of this bill will undermine their ability to protect communities. Now, in response to Representative Swalwell wanting a Republican to say Black Lives Matter, Mr. Swalwell, of course Black Lives Matter. Of course. My black 2 grandsons, their lives matter. My life matters. Native Americans' lives matters. Hispanics' lives matters. White lives matter. Everyone's lives matter. And so do unborn children that are born alive from a botched abortion, which Republicans have brought forward, I think 80 to 100 times a motion on the floor of the House of Representatives saying, please give medical care and save the lives of unborn children that are born alive. And the Democrats have failed to let us hear that bill. So, of course, all lives matter. And with any time I have left, I yield to Mr. Armstrong. And he does not need any more time, so I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ms. Jennings seeks recognition.
Mr. Liu seeks recognition, and Mr. Liu is recognized. We'll recognize Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is one of the most important hearings this committee will have, because what has happened in Minneapolis has brought the nation's attention to problems that this country has had since 1619, when the first slaves were brought into this country. And we had slavery until 1863/65, Emancipation Proclamation / into the Civil War, Juneteenth. And then we had Jim Crow. And then we had post-Jim Crow, which was the Southern Strategy, which was a continuation of a racist policy that we've had for years to keep black people down, to not give them rights, to not give them opportunities to participate in the American dream, to have health care, to have education, to have job training, to not be discriminated against in housing, to not be discriminated against in employment. And it all came to bear. That is the issue that brought us here today, was George Floyd, killed by a police officer with no concern for humanity, one of the most cruel acts ever witnessed, live by individuals on the street, and then immediately thereafter by recordings, video recordings, to where we all saw that officer put his knee on the neck of the man who said, "I cannot breathe," and he didn't give a hoot, because he was a policeman who had been upset that Mr. Floyd apparently didn't cooperate in getting in the back seat of the car, and he was going to teach him a lesson. He was going to teach him a lesson that he would remember for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Not forever, but for Mr. Floyd it was forever. 8 minutes and 46 seconds became forever, because he didn't do what a policeman wanted him to do. And a policeman doesn't have that power. And he didn't have that power in Atlanta, when a man asleep at the Wendy's ran away. He had a taser, but the policeman's not supposed to kill somebody because they're running away with a taser. They should have not used deadly force, but they did it for the same reason that Mr. Floyd was killed, because that officer's ego was hurt. Because that man got away from the officer. That man got that officer's taser, and he was going to teach him a lesson. Police should not be teaching people lessons and kill them because of it. They ought to teach them lessons about, you really shouldn't do this, and let me explain to you why. Community-oriented policing. And there are a lot of policemen that do that. But there's some and quite a few bad apples, and they're mostly focused on African Americans because they focus on people who have the least power in society, because that's where they get off. What I heard last week and what I've heard today from my Republican colleagues has been disheartening, and disheartening. And America should be repulsed by it. Because this hearing's about police, it's about racism, it's about overuse of force against individuals that cost them their lives. It's not about abortion. It's not about Mueller. It should be more about Mueller, but it's not about Trump. Orange Lives Matter. It's not about that. It's not about defunding the police, and it's not about Officer Underwood. It's about police overuse of force, often against African Americans, and America not doing what it should have done rightfully by the people they enslaved and treated as second-class citizens for so many years. That's what this is about. And not to address that subject and to bring up these subterfuges, these ruses, is a disrespect to every African American and to every right-thinking American. And that's what we've gone on when this committee, last week in the hearing, they didn't ask questions about the bill. They talked about defunding the police. Then they come up and they go, well, this Democrat may be for defunding the police, one member of Congress, and this one and that one. Well, Steve King talked about white supremacy. That doesn't mean every Republican was a white supremacist, but that's the way they're interpreting any one person talking about defunding the police. And talking about white supremacists, Miss Underwood was brought here to talk about the riots. That was a bait and switch too. Officer Underwood was killed by a guy named Carrillo, who killed the Santa Cruz sheriff. And that's when they saw that he'd used a white van, a Ford van, and found out that he'd killed Officer Underwood. A white supremacist member of a group called Boogaloo that wants to bring about an impending civil war. But they're not talking about getting rid of white supremacists or people that want an impending civil war in Boogaloo. They didn't know that was the case when they brought him up. But that's what they're talking about, because they wanted to switch it from protesters to rioters. Well, we're all against rioters. We're all for the police. I'm for the police. I think they can be improved upon. But let's get to the issue today, and that's unjust policing and unjust practices against African Americans. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes does Mr. Johnson seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Wanted to give just one further response to Mr. Swalwell, who asked this question. Apparently, he's just not been listening to his colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I think every one of us have said unequivocally over the last few weeks that there is inherent dignity in every single life, not just American, every life around the world. I've said in every interview, national, local, regional, I've said in our subcommittee hearings and in this hearing before in opening statements that it's not just that lives matter, it's that every single human life has inestimable dignity and value. And our value is not related in any way to the color of our skin, where we come from, what zip code we live in, where we went to school, how talented we are, how good looking, what we contribute to society. None of that is relevant. Every single human life has inestimable dignity and value because it's given to us by our Creator. And I have further explained, and so have all my Republican colleagues, that this is an essential thing. It's essential to who we are as Americans. We find this as our foundational creed. We find it listed in the second paragraph, the Declaration of Independence, our nation's birth certificate. G.K. Chesterton was the late British philosopher. He said America is the only nation in the world that is founded upon a creed. And he said it's listed with theological lucidity in the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident. What is a self-evident truth? It's something you cannot not know. Why is that? Because it's stamped upon your heart by your Creator. He said we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Remember, the Declaration does not say we are born equal. It says we are created equal by someone, by God. And they said because we're created by God, He gives everybody the same inalienable rights. Among these rights are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. This was a promissory note, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, to future Americans. We have not lived up to that ideal. We're working on it. The first paragraph, the first line of our Constitution says we do this, we the people do this in order to form a more perfect union. What the House Judiciary Committee is about is working together to form a more perfect union. My friend, I don't know how you've missed all this, but we are all united on that. We all agree that there needs to be meaningful reform. But what we're doing here is having thoughtful dialogue and debate, exactly the kind that was envisioned at our founding, to form and come together with the best answers, the best solutions that will advance the ball for the most American people. That's part of the process. And part of the thing that we've lamented today is that we haven't been part of the process yet. The Democrats proposed this bill, went together in a room somewhere and did not allow us in it. We respectfully requested to be a part of the process. Staff reached out to staff, and we were rebuffed in that request. So if everything that Mr. Cohen just said and others have said is true, if you really want to have meaningful reform, if you really want to improve American policing in a way that will work and will maintain public security and safety, then it seems like you would be open to the thoughtful ideas that we have on the other side. We ought to be doing this together. As I said in my opening statement, the American people expect that, and they deserve it. We don't need partisan squabbles in here. We need all of us to work together and to treat one another with the dignity and respect that our Declaration entitles us to and that the founders recognized was a self-evident truth. Look, I appreciate Ms. Scanlon and others acknowledging the thoughtful amendment of Congressman Armstrong. He comes to this very thoughtfully. We had a meeting last night. He talked about it at length. This is his background, his expertise, and he has a lot to offer, and you ought to listen to him. We've got 20 other amendments here that are equally thoughtful, and we ought to have an important debate. I hope the American people are watching this. I hope they're recording everything we say. And let's not engage in these squabbles about whether we all think life is precious, because every single one of us does. And when we get beyond that squabble, we can get on to the meaningful work of the committee. I'll yield to Mr. Gates.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. In response to the gentleman from Tennessee, he said a hearing is about police. It's not about Mueller. I know that it seems like impeachment was a very, very, very long time ago, eons ago, but the gentleman from North Dakota's amendment doesn't target Mueller or the operations of his team. It seeks broadly to affect this 302 process, but specifically the circumstance we described occurred before Mueller. Before Mueller was ever appointed, before there was even a basis for this embarrassing hoax, you had Jim Comey telling the FBI to go in and trap General Flynn, and they didn't use recordings. And so it just would seem illogical to say that we're here in a discussion about police and law enforcement, but we're going to absolve from that discussion our own FBI. I think the FBI is a relevant topic when talking about police.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Mr. Liu, if we have him.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler and Representative Bass, for your hard work on this legislation. I want to start off by noting that it was a white police officer that put his knee on George Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes and murdered him. It was a member of a white supremacist, actually it was a member of a right wing group that was arrested for killing Patrick Underwood. And we're here because Black Lives Matter. And very few Republican officials have been able to say that. The president hasn't been able to say it. The Attorney General hasn't said it. Most Republican members of Congress haven't been able to say it. And why does that matter? Because you can't fix the problem if you can't even identify the problem. And if you say Black Lives Matter, but then immediately qualify it with All Lives Matter, saying all life is precious, it shows that you don't understand the problem. The problem is we have a system that does not treat all life as precious. It's a system that consistently undervalues Black lives. Now, do blue lives matter? Of course. The system already protects blue lives. Is all life precious? Absolutely. Except the system doesn't view it that way. And that's why we are here. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this system. It wasn't just one rogue cop that killed George Floyd. It was an additional 2 police officers that had their knees on his body, and a 4th officer that was stood as a lookout. But then there was this whole training involved. They were trained in procedures that obstructed people's airways. And then there was the Minneapolis Police Department spokesperson that gave an entirely misleading account of what happened. And then there were the civilians and police officers who knew about Derek Chauvin's prior misconduct and didn't take strong enough action. It takes an entire village to allow for the persistent, systematic murder of Black Americans by government. And if you don't get that, if you think that this is just about a few rogue cops, you don't understand the problem. Right now, Black Americans are killed at a rate twice as high as white Americans by police officers. That's not a few rogue cops, that's an entire system. Now, are there good cops? Are most cops good? Absolutely. Just like most people in this committee, I hope all of us think we're good people too. But good people can perpetuate a bad system. We are part of a system that has repeatedly discriminated against minorities. Just take this pandemic. Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, and Asian Pacific Islanders die at far higher rates than whites. In education, in housing, in our prisons, there are huge disparities between colored people and whites. And we're part of that system. We help create it. Does that make us bad people? That's for historians to judge. But now that we've been made very aware of the police brutality against Black Americans, we have a responsibility to fix it. And the first thing we have to do is to understand the problem. The problem, again, is that Black lives are being undervalued. And either you can help us, my colleagues on this side, to fix this problem, or you can allow the inherent racism of our society to continue. We've got a great bill here. Systematically, these reforms. This is a systematic problem. It is not a matter of a few rogue cops or a few bad apples. Please understand that. Please be able to say Black Lives Matters without qualifying it. Show us you get the problem. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We seem to have gone far afield from the amendment before us. Mr. Armstrong's amendment simply requires federal law enforcement to record interviews with suspects and witnesses. Well, one of the provisions of this bill that I strongly support is the encouragement of police cameras to accurately document police encounters and interviews with the public. And there's a very important reason for that. It provides us with an eyewitness that has an absolutely perfect memory, a video that would protect police officers and the public alike from false charges. Now, Mr. Armstrong's amendment is perfectly aligned with this provision. Just as a police video eliminates all doubt about what happened in a particular encounter, including what was said, this provision eliminates all doubt about what was said in a particular interview. I don't see how anyone who supports the use of police cameras to document encounters would then oppose a provision that would use a police recording to document interviews with suspects and witnesses. So I strongly support this amendment and would ask that the majority consider it.
The gentleman yields back. I would remind the gentleman and other gentlemen that for the safety of their colleagues and the decorum of the House, they should be wearing masks, Mr. Jordan. I now recognize Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm sending my condolences to Mr. Sensenbrenner and Mr. Barr on the loss of their beloved wives. Life is precious, as the ranking member reminded us, drawing on the words of George Floyd's brother. Life is precious, and in the midst of this pandemic, which has cost more than 115,000 lives, we can show that we truly believe life is precious by wearing masks when we're not speaking in this committee room. Mr. Chairman, the whole premise of government, of civil government, is that we'll be safer inside the social contract than we'll be outside of it. in the state of nature, which Thomas Hobbes said was a state of war, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. So we exchange the habits of violent self-help, revenge, and tribal justice for trust in the rule of law and the impartial administration of justice. But the American social contract has never been like that for the African American community. It has been a majestic dream laced with violence and speckled with racist poison. Where was the social contract for George Floyd as Officer Chauvin pressed the air out of his body and asphyxiated him, murdering him over a period of 8 minutes and 46 seconds? Where was the social contract for Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old emergency room technician who was shot at least 8 times in her body, in her own bed, never even having been charged with a crime by officers executing a no-knock warrant? Where was the social contract for 12-year-old Tamir Rice, gunned down after a snowball fight in a park in Cleveland? Where was the social contract for Michael Brown, for Eric Garner, for Rayshard Brooks? Where is the social contract today for African American citizens who often experience fear of the police whose salaries they are paying? The Justice in Policing Act is the beginning, just the beginning of repairing the broken social contract in our country. It bans chokeholds and strangleholds. It requires that deadly force be used only when absolutely necessary to save life. It stops militarizing law enforcement and therefore stops confusing the police, whose job it is to protect and defend our people, with the army, which is trained to kill the enemy. It requires body cameras and dashboard cameras. It ends racial, ethnic, religious profiling in America. It removes the perverse doctrine of qualified immunity in civil rights lawsuits so that neither federal nor state and local officers can escape liability for violent assaults against citizens simply by showing that their exact misconduct, no matter how egregious, had not taken place in exactly the same way before. These are serious, meaningful changes that are the bare minimum any of us would accept and should accept, operating under a Rawlsian veil of ignorance, that is, not knowing whether we ourselves and members of our families would be a citizen with a knee on our neck or a SWAT team in our bedroom in the middle of the night. The Founding Fathers would be proud of this package. The vast majority of the constitutional amendments in the Bill of Rights are efforts to control the police power of the state. The Third Amendment, no quartering of troops in people's houses. The Fourth Amendment, no unreasonable searches and seizures, warrants only based on probable cause. The Fifth Amendment, the privilege against self-incrimination. The Sixth Amendment, the jury trial. The Eighth Amendment, no double jeopardy, no cruel and unusual punishment in our country. The Ninth Amendment. Our founders understood that tyranny begins with the abuse of the police power, and the social contract begins with protecting the dignity, the safety, and the security of each and every citizen and their families. An officer who arrogates to himself the power to kill a citizen who has been subdued appoints himself not just cop, but legislator, prosecutor, judge, jury, executioner. Officer Chauvin appointed himself God when it came to the life of George Floyd. The good cops in America, most of the cops in America, favor reform and oppose the disgraceful actions of Derek Chauvin and those who stood by and did nothing and watched him murder a citizen. The good cops should not be faulted for the crimes of the bad cops, because here we don't believe in collective guilt by association, and mass punishment, the principles that we have had to invoke repeatedly in this committee. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Klein seek recognition?
Move to strike last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The horrific killing of George Floyd has led to millions of Americans speaking out to seek action in the wake of his tragic murder, and I am glad we are here to address it. And I was deeply moved by the testimony we heard last week and had high hopes that we would be able to find a bipartisan way to move forward on real reforms. While I'm still hopeful we can find common ground as we have in the past, I'm disappointed that the debate over solutions has been sidetracked by a coddling of leftist anarchists and a refusal by many on the other side to reject those in Seattle and in other places across the country who want to defund the police. This simply is not a realistic option and distracts from real reform. Our dedicated police officers who serve our communities work to ensure that lawlessness does not prevail in our streets and neighborhoods. The anarchy unfolding within Seattle's autonomous zone, or CHAZ, is an example of what defund the police would look like if implemented across America. I believe there are many ways we can continue to work together rather than put forward policies that divide us. Congress should be working in a bipartisan manner to ensure that law enforcement develops and utilizes the tools and tactics to keep our communities safe while protecting the rights of the people they serve. While H.R. 7120 is well-intentioned, we must make additional changes to the bill in order to strike a balance on reform while respecting the need to maintain the rule of law. Many of the policies included in the bill before us are ideas that can achieve bipartisan consensus. Increased data collection about officer-involved shootings, prohibiting the use of chokeholds and no-knock warrants, making lynching a federal crime, and reducing the militarization of our police forces are all areas where we can potentially find bipartisan consensus. Unfortunately, this bill was crafted without the input of Republicans, and we need to make revisions that not only protect citizens, but ensure the foundational principles of the rule of law are respected in order to get this legislation across the finish line together. It means spending more time here in this room today, and we could have avoided a lengthy day today with consultations occurring before the markup today. As a committee, we should be working together to find solutions to the pervasive problems that exist in our nation and ensure that all Americans are being afforded access to justice under the law. Yesterday, the President made it clear through his executive order he is committed to keeping our community safe and ensuring a fair justice system for all Americans. I truly hope we can seize this moment in time so that Americans can come together, and I hope as legislators we can craft a solution today to make our community safe while strengthening the bonds between our fellow Americans and ensuring justice for all. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Negussi seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, for swiftly bringing up H.R. 7120, the Justice and Policing Act, for markup today. I also want to thank Chairwoman Bass for her incredible work over these many weeks in crafting this legislation. I know she's engaged a broad group of stakeholders and has had many conversations with Democratic and Republican members of the House as well as the administration, and I thank her for her leadership. In addition to her many duties as the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus and, of course, as the chair of the Crime Subcommittee, she's taken it upon herself to be a mentor to new, young black members of Congress like myself. And so I'm very grateful to her for her friendship and her mentorship. I also just want to say that I certainly appreciate my friend from North Dakota in terms of his thoughtfulness, and I recognize that he approaches this issue in good faith. I will be unable to vote in support of his amendment. I think Mr. Buck raises some important points with respect to potential unintended consequences, but I also think that it's worth considering and studying as we move the bill to the floor. But I want to talk about the broader bill and ultimately why we're here today. As a nation, we continue to feel the immense pain and distress over the recent killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others. However, these latest killings did not appear out of nowhere. They are rooted in generations of inequality and injustice. And it is time that Congress address these disparities in policing and create meaningful and structural reform, which is why we are taking up the Justice and Policing Act, which I do believe is a bold and transformative piece of legislation that will increase public safety and will ensure accountability, establishing a national use of force standard, bringing transparency into policing by standing up the first ever national database of civilian police encounters, and providing additional tools to the Department of Justice to root out police misconduct through the use of pattern or practice investigations. I also want to emphasize why, in my view, this amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the chairman is so important. As we all know, the Civil Rights Division has the statutory power to investigate unconstitutional pattern and practices of racial bias and violent policing. It's been a successful tool in reforming systemic police misconduct in the past, and yet it is a tool that the current Attorney General, Mr. Barr, has refused to use in Minneapolis or other areas, and ultimately a tool that the Trump administration has largely discarded. There is no question that these investigations, the resulting consent decrees, have had an impact. They've played an essential role in reforming troubled police departments. An academic evaluation of Los Angeles, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh consent decrees found that court-ordered reforms are likely to result in departments having a stronger, more capable accountability infrastructure and more robust training. But unfortunately, as I said, the DOJ has demonstrated that it is unwilling to use the tools that Congress has provided to address these issues. So we must look to our state attorneys general. We worked, my office, with Colorado's Attorney General, Phil Weiser, and proposed an amendment to the Justice and Policing Act that would provide express authority to state attorney generals to conduct these investigations. The state AGs are in a unique position due to the familiarity and understanding of historical context in their respective states, and it's imperative that they fill in this gaping hole that has been left by the Attorney General's Department of Justice. I'm very grateful to Chairman Nadler for including this amendment as part of the ANS before the committee and support its passage. So again, put simply, I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of this legislation. I appreciate my colleagues considering it respectfully, and I would certainly urge them to support this bill. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? The gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move to strike the last word, please.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. And first of all, let me express my condolences as well to our colleagues, Mr. Sensenbrenner and Mr. Barr, for their families' losses. And I'd like to also thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairwoman Bass, for your work on this legislation. And Ms. Bass, let me just say that this represents a lifetime of work for you. And I totally agree with you. We must have change, and change has to happen now. And it has to be meaningful change, because our communities, our streets demand that we regain the public trust of our public safety officers. You said something in your opening statements that struck me, which was that we should not expect police to fix our social issues. You have a very good point. And one of the issues that I'd like to take note is our national drug policy right now. Federal cannabis policy essentially outlawing cannabis. And as you know, when we talk about arrest disparities, specifically cannabis related, over 650,000 Americans are arrested every year for violating cannabis laws. And according to the ACLU, in every single state, black folks are more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession, and in some states, 10 times more likely to be arrested than others. Many communities have lost many of their loved ones to incarceration due to cannabis-related convictions. And although cannabis reform, in terms of its criminalization, will not undo the practices that have led to these demonstrations that we're seeing today, decriminalizing cannabis will be a major step in the right direction. And as you know, last week during our community hearing, Professor Butler stated that the legalization of cannabis will help create equal justice under the law. And Congress, in my opinion, must move to address decriminalizing cannabis. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'd like to yield the balance of my time. Thank you very much.
Ms. Garcia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to join all the others in expressing my condolences to all those who have lost their loved ones, and also to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairwoman Bass, for the extraordinary work that you all have done on this bill. You know, it just completely continues to baffle me that some suggest that this is all about defunding police. I hope that they've read the bill. It's 137 pages, because I fail to see anywhere in this bill anything about defunding police, disrespecting police, or anything that would would cause anyone to think that. So, Mr. Chairman, I think we need to kind of take a deep breath and kind of really look at what we're talking about today. It is past time for Congress to make systematic changes on issues of racism, police brutality, and racial profiling. We must put an end to the unnecessary use of force by the police that have resulted in the death of one too many Black and brown Americans. As a person of faith, I believe the responsibility falls on each and every one of us to ensure that everyone is treated as a child of God. However, the reality is that George Floyd was not treated as a child of God when he repeated his last words, "I can't breathe." We cannot go back to business as usual and allow George Floyd to be forgotten, perhaps like many others before him. We must lead on this issue to ensure that George is not just one more Black life claimed by the system. As elected officials, it's important that we reform our federal criminal civil rights statutes to protect Black and brown Americans who just want to live and breathe and just walk down the street without fear. Justice demands that we must put an end to brutality, racial profiling, white supremacy, and the vicious racism that continues in America. Justice demands that long-suffering Americans be made whole for being denied their rights as Americans. Is there anything that history has taught us? It has taught us that our laws must boldly affirm that, yes, Black lives matter. We cannot keep ignoring this as a country. In the Latino community, we too are affected by police brutality and racial profiling. As we seek out the truth and speak out when justice demands equality for all, it is important for Latinos to stand with our Black brothers and sisters on this issue because we are affected together. I believe that this bill is the righteous step to the due process that is necessary. As you know, I come from Texas, a state that is home to millions of Latinos and Blacks, and unfortunately too, it's a state that has been deeply affected by multiple incidents of police brutality over the past few years. Many of these incidents have been conducted with unjustified force. I firmly believe that this bill would make Americans safer by guaranteeing police accountability under the law and requiring frayed police-community relations. This bill will save lives and respond to the gross injustices that have resulted in the deaths of so many: George Floyd, Eric Garner, Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, Laquan McDonald, Sandra Bland, Antonio Arce, and Pamela Turner, among others. I say their name because today we are honoring them with real transformative action. Mr. Chairman, I cannot support this amendment, and I strongly support and urge all my colleagues to vote for the underlying bill that is so critical to make real transformational change in this country. We must do it, and we must do it now. Thank you. I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Jeffrey seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your leadership. I thank Chairwoman Bass for her tremendous leadership as well. I don't doubt that this amendment is being offered in good faith. I do not support it. And it has also led us into a discussion that is irrelevant as it relates to the question at hand. You know, the video of George Floyd's murder was not brought to me by a fellow member of Congress. It was not brought to me by my chief of staff. It was not brought to me by my legislative director. It was brought to me by my young Black son, who after Ahmaud Arbery and after Breonna Taylor presented the video to me and simply said, "It's happened again. Dad, what are you going to do about it?" That's why we're all here. Not to talk about Michael Flynn. That's why Americans of every race are in the streets demanding justice and systematic change. What are we going to do about it. Not about Michael Flynn. What are we going to do about Amadou Diallo, Sean Bell, and Eric Garner? What are we going to do about Tamir Rice and Walter Scott and Oscar Grant? What are we going to do about Sandra Bland and Stephon Clark and Breonna Taylor? What are we going to do about George Floyd, who narrated his own death for 8 minutes and 46 seconds? We're not here to talk about Michael Flynn. That's beneath the dignity of this institution and the lives that have been lost. So like so many other young people across America, my young son says he wants to go and protest. And though, of course, like any father, I have concerns, but I let him do what he thinks is right in Brooklyn. But I have to have that conversation with him again that so many of us have had with our young black children. Make sure you have your ID with you. Not because you're a threat, and not his driver's license because he's too young to be able to drive, but because without that ID, your high school ID, someone in law enforcement may think that you're a threat and can detain you for that reason alone. And some may even look at you as a threat because of the color of your skin, just like they did 12-year-old Tamir Rice. And then, of course, I had to say, do not respond or react to any unjustified abuse against you. That's what Eric Garner did. He said, I've had enough. And then he said, I can't breathe 11 times and was choked to death. So even if you're completely in the right, you're being harassed, you're being abused, you can't respond because it may result in your life being taken. And then, of course, I had to say, and if you are detained, don't say anything, don't sign anything. Even if they say to you that you'll be let go. What do you think happened to the Central Park Five? They were given false confessions by law enforcement to sign. So we're not here to talk about Michael Flynn. We're here to solve a problem of police violence, harassment, and the absence of dignity that has occurred not month after month, not year after year, but decade after decade after decade. That's why we're here. And that's why I support the Justice in Policing Act. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move strike last word and yield to the gentleman from North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Anybody who thinks this amendment isn't relevant to what we're doing here has no idea how law enforcement works. And before we want to get too far into this, I want to reiterate, under this bill, without this amendment, this is what happens. Federal agent required to wear a body camera. Federal agent required to have a dashboard camera. In the very scenario we were talking about, gets detained off to the side, turn it all off. Turn it off. You don't need it anymore. When you're being talked to, when you're being dealt with. And just so you know, I said this last week, I come from a state that's 88% white. So these issues are a little different to me. But I have seen a Native American woman charged with obstruction because she was clearly intoxicated and not represented by counsel in her first interview. And shockingly, her second interview didn't match up. I've seen a Hispanic that speaks broken English, not allowed an interpreter, nor a lawyer present, get his plea deal revoked because his first interview was different than his second interview. I'm guaranteeing you this, both of those clients wish those interviews were at least audio recorded, and none of them were in custody according to federal agents. So I yield back.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield the gentleman from Texas, Judge Gomer.
Thank you. And to follow up with Mr. Armstrong's comment, if you truly believe 100% in your heart that there is no one who is racist at all in any federal law enforcement department, then it would be totally appropriate for you to vote against this amendment. But if there is the possibility that any federal, even one federal law enforcement officer anywhere is racist, then you ought to vote for this amendment. And I do appreciate all the wonderful speeches everybody's made, but failed to address this good amendment. Thank you for the good speeches, but this amendment is what we're talking about right now, and it would make a difference. It will make law enforcement better. It will prevent people, even if they, federal officers, even if they have any racist inclinations, from exhibiting those, because it will all be recorded, and you can't hide it in a written 302. So I applaud the amendment, and I'm thankful for that. And I, too, totally express my sympathy for Jim Sensenbrenner's loss, Andy Barr's loss, and I'm grateful everybody is so sensitive to that. That's wonderful. But I yield back to my friend from Ohio.
Thank you. Reclaim my time. I'd also like to add my condolences to the spouses who passed away, Ms. Sensenbrenner and Ms. Barr. And these were truly great people. And this hearing is extremely important, as we all know, and there are many things that we really could work out in a bipartisan manner had we been consulted ahead of time. And I'm hoping that a number of the amendments that I have, I'm going to offer one, but we had three. We're going to be working with Senator Tim Scott to get these actually into law, if at all possible, because there's a lot of good things we could do in this area to reform the police, the vast majority of whom are professionals and work extremely hard and put their lives at risk every day. But apparently there's not a lot of bipartisanship. We'll see. We got more time left in this committee, but we keep seeing a lot of shots across the bow from the other side, which is unfortunate. And I'd like to now yield to the gentleman from Ohio, our ranking member.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The gentleman from North Dakota is exactly right. The two individuals he referenced, the two examples he gave, sure do wish those interviews were recorded. And my guess is the examples Mr. Jeffries talked about probably wish those interactions were recorded. And I know General Flynn wishes his interview was recorded, because we know what they did after that. They went and changed the very notes they took the day it happened. Oh, and by the way, those two agents said after the interview with General Flynn, they didn't think he was lying. They thought he was being straightforward and honest. But they went ahead and changed it because the FBI was out to get him. So I think every example, the examples the gentleman gave from North Dakota, who's a sponsor of the amendment, the examples that Mr. Jeffries gave, who's against the amendment, they probably wanted their interviews recorded too. And I know General Flynn would have liked his interview recorded. And yet the majority is going to vote no. They're going to vote against it. Makes absolutely no sense. They're going to vote against it. I hope this passes. I hope you have a change of heart. I hope we pass the gentleman's amendment and get on with the other good amendments that we're going to offer. I yield back.
Yield back. The gentleman yields back. For what purpose? Ms. Escobar is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, move to...
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, we're here at yet another historic moment, and while I have no doubt of Mr. Armstrong's desire to improve our legislation, I have to express my doubts about some of my Republican colleagues, and I feel like I need to remind folks about why we are here. Last week, as Philonise Floyd sat in front of us, just one day after a memorial for his murdered brother, I asked our colleagues to stop political games and focus on why we were present and to focus on what is in the bill. Well, unfortunately and not surprisingly, they didn't. Most of the members of the minority party chose instead to focus on the defund the police movement, which is not in the bill. And today, at the beginning of this hearing, the ranking member told us that there would be thoughtful amendments offered. I want to remind everyone why we are here. In the face of horrific police brutality and systemic racism that demands a just and honest response, in the face of hundreds of thousands of Americans marching in the streets for justice, we have to, the First Amendment that we're debating is about the Russia investigation. Are our Republican colleagues surprised when the American public believes that they have yet to understand the movement we're seeing unfold in our country? This moment is a reckoning, and we either rise to the moment or we don't. It's about time that we face the racism that has found its way into our institutions. It's about time we call it out, and it's about time we take action. Until there's that recognition and that action against the corrosive and deadly role that racism plays, change won't happen. Lip service is meaningless. Political games are an insult. Enough of time-wasting commissions, task forces, incentives. I support this bill because Black lives matter. I support this bill because it finally forces a reckoning for lives needlessly lost. And unfortunately, no community is exempt. Andres Cortez, Daniel Rodrigo Sainz, Mercedes de Marco, David Alejandro Gándara, Daniel Ramirez, Eric Emmanuel Salas Sanchez. In my own community, too many unarmed people have been killed by local law enforcement, many of them suffering from mental illness. No community is exempt, and these tragedies will continue until we act. I believe that the countless dedicated law enforcement professionals across the country are as hungry for reform as we are. Reform protects good cops, and it exposes bad cops. Reform keeps communities safe, everyone in the community, whether they wear a badge or not. It's time for justice. That can't happen until we have honest conversations. I again urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, it's not too late to think of the innumerable lives lost needlessly at the hands of brutality. Work with us toward justice. Mr. Chairman, I want to yield the remainder of my time to my colleague, Representative Jayapal.
Thank you, Congresswoman Escobar, for those powerful words. I did just want to correct the record because my city was again named by Congressman Reschenthaler, and I just wanted to convey that I spoke to my chief just now, Chief Carmen Best, about the portrayal of her comments by my colleague, and she has told me to convey for the record that her comments have been taken completely out of context. They were not about the protest area at all, and I know my colleagues want to rely on Fox News, but do not. I want to point out that reporting is completely false and constantly debunked. Reports like those that local business owners have been approached by armed people who demanded mob-like protection payments have been completely debunked directly by business owners who have instead said that local businesses are racking up much-needed sales after being hard hit by coronavirus. Fox News has admitted to photoshopping images and showing scenes of a burning city that weren't even in Seattle. It is offensive to keep bringing this up and a distraction from the real work in front of us. This is my district, and I welcome anyone who wants to see what's actually happening to come and visit me. I will happily take you around. In the meantime, let's stay focused, as Congresswoman Escobar has clearly outlined for us, on the real task ahead of us, the bringing about of real, meaningful justice as the Justice in Policing Act before us does. Not something that's a half measure, not something less than what is needed, but something that brings about justice for all of those who are demanding it for their families. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
To strike the last word, Mr.
Gentlelady is recognized.
This committee has considered several pieces of this bill previously. Never before have we considered the bold, broad reform that this bill encompasses. And it is absolutely necessary that all of the measures in this bill be adopted, not the half measures that are being discussed in the Senate. It is heartbreaking to think of those who have been murdered by police, and really heartbreaking to listen to our colleague Mr. Jeffries, whose son brought the video to his attention. This cannot continue in America. Having said that, I do believe that the amendment, obviously this is a markup, we have amendments, that the amendment offered by Mr. Armstrong has merit to it. We do know that this is a problem for defendants. I do have a concern, however, which I have relayed to Mr. Armstrong about the lack of notice in the provision, and I wanted to explain why I'm not able to support the amendment at this moment. But I'm hoping, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, that we can work with Mr. Armstrong between now and the floor to get a clarity on that aspect of the amendment, because it would strengthen the bill, although, as Mr. Jeffries has noted, it is not the core function of the bill. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for recognizing me, and I will happily yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and as I said before, that is our intention with reference to the amendment. The question now occurs on the amendment by the gentleman from North Dakota. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. No. The nays have it.
Roll call.
A roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee?
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch?
No.
Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass? No. Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Richmond? Mr. Richmond votes no. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu?
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal?
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Demings?
No.
Ms. Demings votes no. Mr. Correa?
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath?
I vote no at this moment, but I look forward to more inclusion and discussions on including it possibly in this legislation.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean? Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. McCarcel-Powell?
I'm with Ms. McBath. I would like to discuss with Mr. Armstrong a possibility of working together on getting this through, but at this moment I vote no.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jordan? Yes. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Shabbat?
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Buck? Ms. Roby? Ms. Roby votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock?
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Ms. Lesko? Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes yes. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Stubbe votes yes.
The gentleman.
I also vote no, but after we've discussed the biggest problem with law enforcement, the fact that the unredacted Mueller report was never given to this Judiciary Committee,
I'd
I'll
like
take
to make
up the
a
other
speech
stuff.
with my vote as well. Let
And
me
with that,
take back
I
my
yield.
vote. I want to vote and speak.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Ms. Demings?
No.
Ms. Demings votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how was I recorded?
Mr. Swalwell, you're not recorded.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no.
Has everyone who wishes to vote voted?
Wait 1 minute.
Okay. Ms. Demings, if you would turn on your video.
I vote no.
Okay. Ms. Demings votes no. The clerk will report.
Mr. Gomert, how did you vote?
Yep, I voted yes, and I'd like to make a speech like Mr. Cohen did.
The gentleman votes yes.
Stop.
Mr. Chairman, there are 13 ayes and 25 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. The committee will now stand in recess for 1 hour.
So when it comes to that, basically they're going to have camera 2 try to get people, and you just frame up. So